Hello, everybody. This is my public service announcement that I'm giving to you as a way to help you learn a little bit and understand a little bit more about learning disabilities. I find it very educational to know about it just because there will be times where you encounter them, whether in the classroom or as a parent or even somebody that's hosting a camp. There will be times that you'll want to know what's going on. So, first things first. What is a learning disability? So we've heard the term learning disability and specific learning disabilities. We are given all of these references like the IDEA Act of 2004 and different articles like Article 7. But what does this mean in layman's terms? So a learning disability is a neurological condition that ends up causing a problem or also interfering with the person whose ability is to store, process, and produce certain information. So somehow this condition is affecting how they relay information they've heard, seen, and learned. As a teacher, it's super good to know that you can help a student be successful and achieve success by fostering both their strengths and their weaknesses. Sometimes it's easy to point out a weakness. However, it's also important that we point out the strengths so that they can grow their strengths as well. Learning disabilities are lifelong conditions, and they are an unexpected pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So I think that's really important because it's not ever going to be expected. We as people can trace back to a root cause of what the disability is. Sometimes we'll see blurts all over the place, but it's important to trace it back to its root cause so we can see that specific disability for what it is and then come up with strategies that will give the student opportunity to actually learn in a way that they can understand material. It's not just about the weakness. There are intellectual disabilities where learning rates are slower and there's going to be support needed for specific areas, whether it be math calculating or reading comprehension or orally. All of those are intellectual disabilities that can occur. Some of those include dyslexia or different things like that. I think it is important to note the federal definition just because that gives us a basis for what we're standing on. It's going to be a disorder, a specific learning disorder in which one or more basic psychological processes are affected. This is not due to other causes, so it's not from a brain injury or a fall. The child has a difficulty in learning, and they don't achieve things at the proper age rate. So while their class is achieving certain things and acquiring certain levels, they are not. The discrepancy between achievement and intellectual inability is one or more of the following areas. So it's typically either orally or listening comprehension, reading, writing, math reasoning, math calculation, those kind of things. Normally you'll see one or more pop up. But no child, just so you know, wants to be defined by their area of weakness. We should not exclude the rest of the child. So while it is easy to see the weakness for what it is and try and just hone in on that, we also need to give the child their entire perspective of who they are as a person and work with them fully. There are also these things called emotional and behavioral disorders. These are conditions in which one of more of these following characteristics are typically exhibited over a long period of time that adversely affect educational performance. So one of these can be it's really hard to learn and it can't be explained through intellectual, sensory, and health factors. Another can be it's hard to maintain and build these personal relationships with not only their peers but their teachers. Inappropriate types of behavior and feelings, pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, and then this tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears that are associated with not only school but personal problems. This is taken from IDEA. A different definition that we like to go on seems to be that there is it's more than just this temporary response to stressful events in the environment. There's an actual disability between behavioral and emotional responses in the school program based on age, cultural, ethnic norms, and responses that affect educational performance. There is typically a disability that coexists with these other disabilities. So examples of these would be anxiety, mood disorders, conduct disorders, schizophrenia, all of those things. And there's many different causes for those as well. So, language disorders are also kind of referred to this word called acquired aphasia or developmental aphasia. I feel like for us, this word developmental aphasia, it's huge, I know, but it affects us differently because we're teachers teaching children. So, this typically describes children that have a really hard time acquiring language orally. So, they tend to be not able to speak how they are hearing what is going on. So there are two different types, two different difficulties that these children can have. One is with receptive language disorders, and one is called expressive language disorders. So in layman's terms, a receptive language disorder is like difficulty understanding language as a whole. So it's a child has language problems. They can understand like simple words like, oh, there's a chair, and here is some candy, or here is a bucket, or here is some chalk. But when you combine these things together, like here, sit on the chair with your chalk and eat your piece of candy, it can be difficult for them to understand what that meaning is as a whole sentence. So as words are singled out, they can understand, but as they combine them together, there's a hard time. It seems that there is not a connection that's able to be comprehended from the single word into the context of an entire sentence or phrase. Meanwhile, expressive language disorders are a difficulty in the spoken language. So while receptive seems to be more about understanding language, the expressive language disorder refers to spoken language. So that's the language that's actually coming out of the child's mouth. So children with this disorder typically depend on like using signals, hand signals, like pointing to something or coming, like gesturing to come here, or all things like that. So because they're having trouble getting it out verbally. It's not to be taken that they have any sort of muscular paralysis that makes them not able to talk. It's nothing to do with the fact that their body doesn't move their mouth. It just has a lot to do with they have difficulty in making the actual sounds and producing those words and speaking out loud. There are conditions that come from expressive language disorders, such as dysnomia, if I'm saying that correctly. It's when you're having trouble remembering and then expressing that word out loud. So they end up using a substitute word for something else. So that could be one specific condition that comes from expressive language. But yeah, sometimes they have the thought in the mind, but they just can't get it out in the correct word form. Oftentimes, there are going to be procedures and steps and processes to get a student to identify as having a specific learning disability. There is a process to this. So basically, in parent-friendly terms, there needs to be something going on. Something's noticed in the classroom, something's talked about at home from a parent. There's just been some sort of indication that something's not right. So one of two things can happen. One, it can be a comprehensive evaluation can be done of the student with the suspected disabilities. So this uses observational data about student behavior, educationally relevant medical findings, all of these things, recommendations based on the data are all, and potentially the ability and achievement levels are put into that, and an evaluation is done. On the other hand, and what is recommended lately is called the response to intervention, also known as RTI. So this is used for all students at risk of failure and for potential learning disabilities. It's used to prevent disabilities early on. The goal is definitely to prevent failure. So this comes before anything else. You are like, okay, we're going to do RTI just to see if we can help this child along the way if we're not meeting a specific need. So there are 3 tiers to RTI that are useful for the screening tool. The lowest tier is called Tier 1. And this is when a high quality instruction is given in a general education setting, and there is monitoring of the student's progress. So it's not too rigorous, it's just simply high quality instruction. If the students do not respond to this tier at Tier 1, they end up going to Tier 2. In Tier 2, more intensive evidence-based instruction is provided to the students, so one-on-one or group works or just different things like that, using support teachers in the classroom. This is the option for Tier 2. If there is a response, then that means they do not need to continue further and they do not have a learning disability. However, if there's no response still, they move on to Tier 3. Tier 3 is the highest intensity. It is evidence-based interventions taught in small groups, individually. There's progress monitoring that's still continued, and that child is worked with in a very personal way. If there's a response, that's good. No specific learning disability. If there is no response, however, they may be considered for a comprehensive evaluation, and that's when the comprehensive evaluation begins. There are some negatives that we've seen from RDI. We don't know about the costs, and not all children respond well to these. However, it is evidence-based, and it has been very useful for reducing over-identification. So after that is completed, and let's say the student didn't do well in any of those tiers and was passed on for a comprehensive evaluation, that will happen. So there are these steps called pre-referral activities, and this is when support teams develop these activities for a student before referring them for special education. So this is when like a teacher coincides with some sort of other team to see what we could do to possibly make sure that they might not have a disability and give them every opportunity to succeed. So most schools require evidence that there is a pre-referral process. So basically you've had to try something. Then there's a referral and initial planning process. So the referral can come from anybody. It can come from the parent, the teacher, other professionals in contact with the student, or it can even come from the student themselves. But once the referral is made, the school has to follow up with the parents. Next step, assessment. So there's typically an assessment done through multidisciplinary evaluation. This is not to be scary, but it's just basically a bunch of people working together to evaluate the child. So this can include a social worker, the nurse, the school psychologist. If they're having trouble reading, like a reading specialist, an academic performance and behavior is assessment throughout the class. Just these different tests are administered in native language, and other evaluation data can also be attained during this time. So it's all about assessing where your child is at and what's going on. Finally, the IEP meeting and writing of the IEP. So in an IEP meeting, there are different participants. One is the parents. Two is at least one general education teacher. The third is a special education teacher. Four is a representative from the school who can either qualified to provide this direct instruction the child needs, or be able to supervise the child, knows about the general education curriculum, and then also knows about available resources for them. The fifth option is an interpreter of instructional implications. So basically interpreting the evaluation assessments, being able to give the results in a way that everybody understands. The sixth is other individuals that the parents invite that have knowledge about the child. And then finally, the child when appropriate. So this IEP is then created, and then it is implemented in the classroom, and the teachers get that and make sure they work alongside of the special education to make sure what is implemented is actually happening. Lastly, there will always continually be review and reevaluation of student progress just to make sure they're on track for what they need to be doing. So there are ways that the schools support students with specific learning disabilities. Hallelujah. One is a very general, but I also think very important thing to mention, differentiated instruction. I can recall last year I kept getting this word and I was just like, I have no idea what this means, and I'm a teacher. Differentiated instruction is when the teacher tweaks or differentiates the instruction that they're giving to students. So for me, it would be me responding to students' personal interests, background knowledge, experiences in life, using what they can relate to in the classroom to meet their needs. So whether that's including their name in an example problem or making a situation that they might have had this past week. It's using a special method to help each child learn. So while one child may learn through writing out the problem, another child may learn through using their hands. Another child may learn through hearing it a couple of times. So making sure you meet the need of all children. You can identify cognitive processing approach that helps the child learn. So there are these tests that can be done so you can see how the child is learning, so you can make sure you're accurately portraying what needs to be portrayed in the classroom in order to give them what they need. The second thing I'd like to point out is providing accommodations and modifications for students with specific learning disabilities. Yes, there is a difference, as I have learned. So Accommodations are not always adequate enough for children with SLDs. They need specialized instruction to work through their weaknesses, so that typically comes from an outside source, being like a special education teacher. A modification to a curriculum can be perfectly reasonable for students with more pronounced disabilities. When you're modifying, it's different than an accommodation. So an accommodation is like extended time, or letting them use a keyboard instead of handwritten note, like handwriting the answers. Those are accommodations. Modifications happen when you change or tweak the actual curriculum. So if you're making less problems or making their content a little different or simpler. One way to accommodate, you can shorten the task by breaking them into smaller pieces. You can improve listening ability by keeping instructions short and simple. And then you can make tasks more interesting by appealing to students. That's an accommodation. That's also working with differentiated instruction at the same time. So those are two really good ways that the school supports students with specific learning disabilities. Accommodations are always brought through and looked at through IEPs. So you have to make sure you check the IEPs to make sure that their accommodations are actually happening in the classroom. So if a kid can use a calculator when other kids can't, you need to make sure you know that. Modifications can happen in conjunction with the special education teacher. So all this to say, specific learning disabilities can tend to have a negative connotation, just because our world seems to see if you have a disability, like it's almost like broken, but that's not the case. In fact, we know that because we've seen plenty of people with learning disabilities thrive. So it's all about how we treat them and how we point out that the disability itself is not the person. The person has a disability, but there are so many more factors. So what can we do to make their experience in education a positive one? How can we grow them, and how can we take what they have as a disability and make it into something beautiful, something that doesn't get shut down by everybody around them?